Kevin Leach is the main director for Sabre Training Advisory Group, a professional military training nonprofit. Their aim is to give Ukrainian defenders the skills to come home alive. Kevin is a Canadian Armed Forces veteran with a long history of working in Ukraine and in military affairs. He served as a sergeant from 2008 to 2018, specialising in armoured reconnaissance. He leads a weekly segment on the Mriya Report called Come Home Alive, covering the key elements of training for the Ukrainian army. And I'm delighted to say this is the second conversation we're having on the channel. It's definitely going to become a regular feature because our last conversation was sort of thrilling and stimulating. I know many in the audience felt the same. So welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please like, subscribe, definitely add a comment to this video to help it perform in YouTube. YouTube's algorithm is especially harsh at the moment for some reason against long form content like the stuff that we produce here. Please also do check out Sabre Training Advisory Group website. I'm going to put a link on here. They've got a donate button. As always, it helps Ukraine to remain resilient. Once you've done that, also consider buying me a coffee. It really does help to keep the channel going and keep this work going. But enough of the plugs. Kevin, welcome to the channel.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's good to be back.
And we should explain you don't live in the car, but it's the only way you can get a stable internet connection.
Yeah, it's there's generally always 4G somewhere, and power for sure, so I could plug my phone in. And today I had to do, as I said before we started recording, I had to do a little bit of a rescue mission out of the city. So car it is.
Yeah, well, no problem. I mean, it's the main thing is to talk here, and the first thing we're going to talk about, I think, is the culture wars, because these are not something that Vladimir Putin invented. It's not something that Russian propaganda invented, but it's certainly something they seek to leverage, weaponize, and pour petrol on the flames. I'm going to try to examine that, but you're coming from a Canadian perspective. You are, of course, closer to the US as well, and the various political things that have been going on since 2016 and after that. Do you think there's some commonality between the culture wars between the US, Canada, and UK, or are there significant differences?
There's well, they're both. There certainly are differences because we are, despite our cultural proximity, we have very different societies, very different practical situations, and but the similarities I think are probably more numerous. Having a shared language. The fact that, I mean, between, you've got Canada, the United States, and Britain, obviously there's a cultural progenitor in the room. And so we are coming from that kind of common root over with you guys. But definitely they bleed into each other constantly. The discussion of political issues in Canada, I never thought the day would come when the Canadian Prime Minister was a common topic of conversation for British people or others throughout the Anglosphere, even Americans, because we're, it's there's always that little silly thing that we're America's hat, but our entire population would make us only one of the medium-sized states in the United States. So we don't have the same cultural weight, really, but these days it's you have these sort of omni causes and omni crises that are shot through. Mainly, I'm gonna refer a lot to the Anglosphere because it's mostly the shared English-speaking parts of the world that have these issues shooting through them. It's something that probably we should touch on later. Is we also it leads to a problem because we oversimplify and we assume that the cultural problem A that exists in Canada is the same as cultural problem B that looks similar that exists in the United States, and it's the same as cultural problem C that looks similar and exists in Britain. But they're different situations requiring different solutions and frankly different discussions. But those aren't being had because everything kind of gets smooshed together, oversimplified, and then stared at through a lens that is really suited to none of these issues, but has become a kind of amalgamation. And so it's certainly more similarities than differences, but that leads to oversimplification.
Well, we can get into some of the values because, of course, the question of religiosity is an interesting one, with the UK being far more secular society. So, some of those conservative talking points and some of the stuff you see on the evangelical right in the US, which certainly is a key target for weaponization within this Russian divide and conquer strategy, that stuff doesn't really work in the UK. So they have to choose something else. But is there a commonality in that when particular groups, and let's face it here, this may be on the right, it may be on the left as well, because you can weaponize identity from both sides of the political spectrum. In fact, this isn't just a pure right thing for all those who are shaking their hands going, yes, but what about wokery, etc. Well, it's possible to manipulate people on the extremes, both extremes of the political spectrum. But is the commonality that they create a threatening environment? They basically say that there's these people over here and they're a threat to you, right? You can't see them as fellow countrymen. You can't seek commonality with them because they threaten your wealth, your values, your belief, your identity. These seem to be the core pillars that make this stuff work.
It's absolutely the case. It's again, it's I guess probably a series of oversimplifications, and yeah, you draw people into really non-productive online conversations where like you're lacking tons of nuance. So already it gets simplified, and then you create narratives or feed into narratives that further oversimplify things. And like my background in kind of culture war stuff, obviously I'm not a well-known internet personality, but I was involved in a lot of when Canada started bringing in a bunch of speech laws. I was involved in the kind of free speech counter protesting. I was in my university's free speech club. We went to protests in support of Jordan Peterson and other professors who were saying, "Hey, I'm being told by my faculty or whatever that I have to have some kind of speech code." We were against that sort of thing, but then I saw that was like 2014, 2015, but I saw then the little seeds here and there of the culture war that would come later on, and the way that it would get twisted, because we'd have a free speech gathering or whatever you want to call it, like a rally with an open mic, and then an actual self-declared doctrinal white supremacist would come along and be like, "This looks like a job for me," and try and then come up on the stage, and it was so then you'd have like the communist club, or because there were two communist clubs in my university, but the Stalinist club in my university. Then they would say, you see the Free Speech Club are a bunch of Nazis. Now the Free Speech Club, the leadership team was like 3/4 Jewish, so I can't remember Nazis being overly eager to accept Jewish people, but nonetheless, that's how you saw like that. It became this just completely stupid mudslinging. I would say mudslinging contest, but the mudslinging in that case was only in one direction. But it was the precursor, and it was really so that Stalinist club at my university, down the line years later, 2022 comes, and they're saying like, we need immediate ceasefires. We must not get NATO involved. Supporting Ukraine will only prolong the war. And I can't help but wonder if there was, if this is just another situation of like the Comintern sending out instructions on, here's what we say as the Communist International. We're all one unified party, even if we're across the world. And so here's what we say, because it was those same talking points. But now in 2022, it's not just the it's not just the Stalinists. I'm trying not to swear. It's not just the Stalinists that are saying it, but then you have the, Canada doesn't have so much of an equivalent, but I'll use the example of the America First nationalists, and they're saying the exact same stuff. And it even gets commented on. There's a comic some people will be familiar with called Stone Toss, and it's like you have these guys. They're in a tug of war, and the communist. It's like, I don't remember exactly how it is, but you see like a communist and some kind of stereotypical plutocrat looking at each other puzzled because they're pulling on the same side of the rope, and it is like that. It's, you know, the clubs, like the people that were coming out and screaming at some of the people that were coming out and screaming at us when we went to rallies, free speech rallies in Toronto, are now together with some of the people that they were screaming at, sort of on our side. You know, obviously the sides don't exist, but no, it's the Russians right from the beginning. You know, they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. They're, you know, yes, comrade, definitely capitalism is terrible, and then yeah, hey, you know, I also hate whatever, you know, insert scapegoat here. We should deport all of them. They do both, and they try to be everything to everyone, and it funny enough, it unifies a lot of. It's very strange. It unifies a lot of people who say that they're against authoritarianism, but in their nature are very authoritarian.
The libertarians are a
It's
classic example, you know, Elon Musk and so on. Free speech at any price. Oh, but hang on a second, what are you actually doing with the platform you control? You're implementing lots of little checks and balances that downweight things you don't agree with and people you don't agree with. And there seems to be some undeclared agenda there, but you're pretending you're neutral. We'll tackle that in
the
a
more
minute, because
things change.
neutrality is an interesting topic. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's there are so many seemingly contradictory people and points of view that seem to be singing off the same hymn sheet.
It becomes suspicious. I think a little. I'll be honest. I think on our side we make too much of um, the potential of someone being a Russian agent. I don't. I just what I think the main issue is. We'll maybe get into it a little bit later. Is the commonality that I found that ties the kind of culture war sides together is they're primarily on the internet, and they get their information entirely from the internet. Because out here on our team, we've had instructors who are like dyed in the wool, stereotypical blue city university Democrats, and then, you know, Appalachian Trump voting sort of, you know, Republicans, but like not no party ideologues, just sort of people that fit into these archetypes. But here, where they're dealing with reality, there's a unified goal, there's a unified perspective, you know, because they're out here, and so they react to the war in a way that makes a lot more sense, you know, more closely aligns with reality. Whereas like Elon Musk drives me nuts, because I don't believe he's a stupid person, but he seems to think that he can discern truth from reading enough Twitter. And, you know, I never used Twitter prior to the invasion. I just got on it for professional reasons, really. Every time I go on, if I spend more time than it takes for me to tweet, I immediately regret it and get angry at myself. But it has, whether we like it or not, it has become this not just a battleground, but a kind of feeding trough. It's ideal for Russian manipulation. Not that they're, you know, again, not that they're making everyone agents, but they are going out and they're polluting the information space with all kinds of garbage. And because, you know, someone who's, even people, look, coming out here, I came out here in 2018. It took me a full year to realize that my cultural framing, the way that I thought of things being a Canadian, and just going, oh, I see this, therefore that. It took me a year to realize that I was just coming up with wrong answers constantly. and that I was truly in a completely different culture. So even for people on the ground, they're still gonna have mistakes of this perspective, or due to their perspective. But when people are just reading about things out here on the internet, it's totally distorted, and they are bound to get things wrong. But because I think the culture war is primarily an online phenomenon, it has real life effects. But the average person, you can grab an average say non-social, like non-Twitter user, and ask them about a dozen social war issues, and they're going to go, I have no idea what you're talking about, get away from me, because it's just stuff that they don't encounter in their day-to-day lives. Nonetheless, it shapes so much of, because politicians unfortunately spend a lot of time on social media, especially on Twitter, because they think they're going to get, you know, more on the pulse or whatever, and then decisions get made because of this completely goofy online conversation that is drawing from online sources of information that, it's like someone's in a very siloed part of Twitter, for example, and they're saying, hey, if there's a war in Ukraine, how come there's no video? It's insane. But from that person's perspective, because they're in that silo, they're not being shown the footage. And because they have this faulty thinking that the internet is bringing them an adequate amount of information, they're coming to a logical but completely incorrect conclusion. And that is, I think, probably the worst part of, or the worst effect that the culture war has on things out here, is it just creates this polluted and distorted information sphere.
And of course, people looking at that, Russia's going to know that certain people are turned off by that. They're turned off by the extremes of that debate. And in fact, that's another aspect of how this works, isn't it? Because you might have the majority of people sitting in the center looking at these extremes. It makes them nervous. It makes them uncomfortable. Their information sphere is becoming sort of polluted with stuff. And they see that if you go into battle with that, it's exhausting. It can seem pointless. It can be psychologically and emotionally traumatic going to head. You find yourself screaming all the time, screaming at the screen anyway, at the keyboard. The natural result is to either drop out. But if you're someone who's still, I would say likes to think about things, you can't drop out without giving yourself an excuse to do so. And this is where Russian propaganda comes into its own. With the phrase, you'll heard the Russian phrase, "Это неоднозначно." It's not so simple. There's always two sides. It's complicated. So they give you that little get out of jail free card, and it works.
It's all just too hard to keep track of. The number one question that I'm asked when I visit Canada, just like, okay, not the number one question I get asked by people that don't know what I do, and then ask what I do, and then I tell them. So they find out that I'm in Ukraine, and the number one question is, what's really going on over there? This goes just beyond the internet as well, like into news even. The information space well, I think all over the world has just become so fraught and so full of lies and attempts to manipulate people, that now really people are, I mean, in some ways maybe it's good, because people are learning to fall back on trust only what you can verify. But it's also making it very hard to verify these things, because how do without knowing someone who's over here that you can communicate with and trust, how the heck do you verify anything?
Then we are rebooting the conversation, hopefully where we left off. And again, this is explanation in the description, but essentially it's very difficult to sometimes in a war zone get a good Wi-Fi signal. So this is the explanation to the audience. We recorded this particular episode on 2 different days, 2 different locations. You'll spot all the continuity differences. But there we go. Um, One of the debates that's come up, really, even since we last spoke, is this, what I would say is very much a Kremlin narrative, and that is that peace at any price. And this is what Russia seems to be pushing at the moment. It's like, yes, the war's not going our way, but it's not going Ukraine's way. Make a peace now while you still can, because when we really get going, you're going to have a far worse peace deal. There seems to be the narrative coming out of the Kremlin, certainly, and many of the spokespeople, propagandists, but we sort of hear a narrative not too different to that coming from people like Trump, Farage, and others on the left. This isn't purely a left-right thing. This message seems to be floating up from all sorts of quarters.
It's because we're in a war, and you use any weapon that you can when you're in a war. And the something that I think is really needs to start being talked about on our side is something called gray zone or entropic warfare. And part of it is information warfare. You look at all of these different Axis countries do this: Iran, China, North Korea, Russia. Russia happens to be the best at it, where they just inject quote unquote alternative narratives. This is a different way to interpret this, and that's where we got the how we got this really obscure Russian academic propaganda idea that Ukraine was never its own separate country and was Putin said it was founded by Lenin. There's examples here in Kiev of the trizub, the ancient Ukrainian symbol, and those on like 1,000-year-old coins. And so it's just yeah, here was this national symbol, and perhaps people didn't use the word Ukraine, but there was an identity, there was an idea, a national idea that's 1,000 years old. But yes, tell me about friggin' Lenin. How else does that get injected? Well, that gets and it gets especially bad because, as I said before, the culture war happens online primarily, and you get these folks that think that they can learn enough just by reading what people are saying on Twitter, which, oh my God, what a disaster that is for our society, that people can think that. But they do, and so they come across this argument now, and some of this stuff can sound very persuasive because it does explain, and it is plausible enough if you don't dive deeper. Myself, I don't think anybody can accuse me of not supporting Ukraine enough. But when I first came out here, I didn't know anything about the history between Ukraine and Russia, and it wasn't until about 6 months in when I read a big history book on it, and I learned about the truth. I learned about ancient Ukrainian history. I learned about the even a little bit of Russian history, but most importantly, the relationship between the two. That's only when I gained enough knowledge of the situation to understand how implausible the Russian narrative is. Uh, People don't have the time and bandwidth to bring that in, and then unfortunately, the way that our media works, new and old, it's sound bites, oversimplifications, and kind of like memes, especially. When I say memes, I don't mean image macros, but I mean it in the original sense of just these highly heritable ideas. That is we're seeing that now come out in these political debates because yeah, we have political leaders that whether they're it makes I don't hold I probably run against a lot of people on our side where I don't hold with the contention that all of these people are wittingly working for Russia, but they they are running into this like plausible enough idea. They know, okay, my political opponents say this thing, so in order to differentiate myself, I have to say I have to take the opposite side. I have to be contrarian, and it's that's stupid. It's very stupid, but I won't put to malice what is better or what is potentially explained by incompetence. But at the end of the day, it makes no difference because the effect for us on the ground is the same, whether they are wittingly working for Russia or just repeating the narrative because of stupid culture war reasons. And yeah, this so NATO expansion, right? NATO expansion, NATO expansion, NATO expansion. Until now, Mr. Brexit himself, Nigel Farage, is back in the running, and he's hooking into his old branding, and now it's EU expansion. There's no EU defensive pact. There's no, thank God, there's no EU army. What? And no one's, it's stupid. But as I said before, no one is challenging why it's stupid. Everyone's just calling each other names, because you could go, what about CSTO expansion? What about CIS expansion? Let's fire it back there and say that is an equally plausible explanation. Or let's not play on their field, and let's just say, hey, belonging to the EU and belonging to NATO are things that you ask for. They are voluntary associations. It's very funny because we talked about it a little bit before we started talking about the sort of anarchists and the libertarians. But those guys are crazy for voluntary associations. Now, at the state level, they would argue that that's not voluntary, but whatever. The point is that NATO and EU are fundamentally different than joining NATO and the EU is fundamentally different from being conquered by Russia. And it behooves us on this side, when our enemies start making these stupid when you know the truth arguments, but that are still plausible to people who simply, I don't blame people for not knowing Russian and Ukrainian history in the way that I do. But when our enemy and people that parrot our enemies start making these arguments, it behooves us to make better arguments, to counter it and say, and that's one thing that it's kind of funny, because I think, like, when we talk about culture war stuff, I don't mind saying I am a bit of a refugee from the sort of opposite side that a lot of people who support Ukraine find themselves on. What I was talking about before, like being in the free speech club at my university and going to the sort of protests in support of Jordan Peterson. That's definitely not the traditional support base for Ukraine. But I think it's worth, I think that I'll be able then to offer a lot in saying to people, like, how you want to engage with the other side and you want to undermine Russian support on that side. I'll tell people how it's done. They want you to argue with them. They want you to bring them logical arguments and not scream Nazi at them. Don't because people did that to me. People screamed Nazi at me, and I'm like, okay, fuck you. Like, now, you're telling me I'm something I desperately hate, and you're telling me that you're something that, remember the whole like punch a Nazi thing. It's like, listen, I agree with you if the person is actually a Nazi, but when you call me a Nazi and you say punch a Nazi, do this, do that to a Nazi, hey, we're laying terms where I now need to view you as an enemy. And it's not because I'm a Nazi, but it's because you won't consider me as anything else. And that's where, it's something that's worth. It's also where, like, we can really get these types, sort of the alternative narrative people, we can really get them on, like, how come you guys don't ever invite pro-Ukrainian people, onto your shows, onto your media? Nigel, why don't you talk with someone that knows a lot about Ukraine, to like, why don't you debate it? Why don't you actually bring these ideas forward, bring your ideas forward against someone who holds differing ideas? That is how we will. We don't need to undermine them in our support base, but that's how we'll undermine them in their support base. And if we're lucky, we can fool we'll never fool the witting supporters of Russia, but the unwitting supporters of Russia, we don't need to fool. We need to convince them to come over on our side. And it's possible to do. our operations director, we were talking about it today, actually. He was talking to sort of like a private security guy that's working out here who was very, strangely enough, he was working here in Ukraine while being quite not anti-Ukraine, but sort of in that narrative bubble. And just by talking to him and saying, hey, I think it helps being in the atmosphere here and seeing that what you may be told about Ukraine in that narrative bubble is not the same as what you'll actually experience here. But at any rate, he was able to engage that guy and swing him onto our side. And I think that we have the opportunity to do that, but we've got to fight the impulse to rage at people because it's easy to do. This is a war. Crimes are being committed. I'm 40 minutes away by car from the site of really, really horrific. I don't know if I really need to say what happened in Bucha and Irpin. We don't need to retread it, but that's I've been there. I was there in the summer of 2022, and you can feel it. It's palpable. That emotional energy is fueling us. And the first time that I went back to Canada, I was kind of trapped in this like war thinking that people are either on my side or they're my enemy, because that is the kind of thinking it's necessary to work out here. It doesn't work. It doesn't work in the West, and it won't work in the culture war because the stakes are not actually that high. And in an argument, for example, with my uncle, my uncle isn't going to pull out an AK-74 and shoot me. And I'm not going to do that to him. So there's absolutely no reason for me to get that emotionally charged and put myself into that fighting mindset. And so I think people on our side who are engaging in the culture war need to keep that in mind. It's the stakes. The stakes, it is, yes, part of the war, but the stakes are not the same as they are out here. And as long as people can keep that in mind, they can hold themselves emotionally under control enough to then start to do what I've suggested, which is to engage with these people. And you have to keep in mind, say tomorrow, by some bizarre consequence, I was going to debate Nigel Farage. I'm not there to change Nigel Farage's mind. I'm there to present equally plausible arguments that go against what Nigel says in order to convince the people who support him. Maybe not even not to vote for him, just not to believe the Russian stuff. And when and if he is elected and he starts to present this, well, actually, I think that we should look at cutting support to Ukraine, that his voters will say, hey, I support you for this issue, this domestic issue. I do not support you for allowing a vile dictatorship to go and have a free hand. So I've gone on a little bit of a tangent,
That's
but
it. It's a tricky one, isn't it? Because
yeah,
similar arguments can be made with Trump, and screaming at Trump supporters is really not going to help anybody. But there are different categories of people. There are those who are so far down the rabbit hole that no amount of evidence, no amount of persuasion will drag them up out of that very deep hole. So you have to ask, is it really worth expending so much energy on that person who is resisting fact-based or evidence-based arguments?
yeah.
There are others, as you say, who it's a grift, it's a thing, it's not something they're going to change their mind on, because that's not what they're doing. That's not the game they're playing. They're putting forward a point of view they don't necessarily believe in, and there are certain reasons why they may be doing it, self-interest and all sorts of others. But there certainly is a third category who are like, well, I heard this. And whenever I hear these kind of words, it suggests there might be some wiggle room there, some kind of doubt. Well, I heard this, or I was told that. At this point, starting to give narratives and say, okay, well, why don't you talk to someone who's been there? Why don't you talk to someone who knows the Russian language? And there's little telltale signs in people's language. You think, okay, it might be worth here expending a bit of effort, because this is like a loose rock, and let's prise it open a little bit.
Think I would say to people, think like a soldier. And when you're a soldier, you think about, there are fights that are winnable, where you're like, okay, I'm going to set the conditions and I'm going to engage this enemy and destroy them here, or carry out whatever effect you want to here. And then there's fights where you're going, oh boy, I'm gonna do everything I can so that they don't notice me, and we're gonna bypass this, or we're gonna pull out of the area, whatever. You make there's the decision to engage, the decision not to engage. And yeah, like a grifter, like what's that? I'm holding my vocabulary in check when I describe these people, but oh boy, yeah, I mentioned before Jackson Hinkle. There's no reason to ever talk to Jackson Hinkle because just a stupid name. The guy's a little worm, and he knows what he's doing, and he wants to be some little paid Valdai speaker. That's not there's nothing to engage there, except to try and humiliate him to catch him out. But again, you're doing that to persuade his audience and not him. But it's, I've got here, I've written, it's like, the grifters like him are the most convenient entry point for these Russian propaganda narratives, because a person like Hinkle or these trollish, values-free Instagram accounts or Twitter accounts, they're just there generating outrage. And they're going to push that narrative because it pushes their engagement, which makes them money. And they don't like they truly, you see this with grifters everywhere, and it's very funny because these same people will be criticized by both sides when it's people who actually hold values, because they hold no values. They just have a grift. They have a grift, which is what's going to get my engagement up. Don't engage with those guys. Yeah, definitely. When you see someone, they say, well, this is what I heard. When someone says to you, this is what I heard, they're telling you what they heard. They're not inviting you to browbeat them. They're inviting you to smile and say, I heard that same thing. And I spoke to someone who's over there, and here's how they explained it. There's so it's like avoiding a fight in real life. Okay, one time in my life I've been unable to avoid a fight. The rest of the time I've talked my way out, and I've either through guile lied my way out of the situation, or I have found that there's common understanding and common ground. We had a friend and I were out here in Podil, and we saw like a guy yelling at a woman, and he's also a military guy. We walked over and did the stereotypical, hey, what are you yelling at her about? And it was a situation where we didn't understand the full context. They were in truth yelling at each other. It was a guy who was missing a limb, and he had a big 3rd Assault Brigade tattoo on him. Very easy at that point when you get closer to understand what the situation is. This is someone who's been traumatically injured, and the woman that he was yelling at was his girlfriend. So this is basically a relationship argument that's happening out in public. Not great, but not necessarily something that requires our intervention, because again, there was nothing physically violent. It was just two people that are under a hell of a lot of stress, having that explode out in public. But you know what? We talked to the guy. We rather than starting a fight, we de-escalated things, and we got perspective, and that's almost always an option in discussions that you have with people, unless they're these really convinced ideologues. Like if that guy had been just a bloodthirsty ape going after a random woman, we wouldn't have been able to talk to him. We wouldn't have been able to de-escalate things. And that's what, that's what we have to do if we're going to, in the information sphere, if we're going to win this thing. Because, I don't think that many people on the other side in the culture war, I really truly don't believe that they're like, huge fans of Russian soldiers going and raping children. I don't think they actually defend that. Some of them may believe it didn't happen. Some of them may be, they may be under false narratives, like, like this, oh, it's made up. And you can say to these people, are you prepared to hear the testimony of women that were raped? Are you, you know, are you ready to? I'm not, you know, it's out there. It's not like these guys recorded their crimes. Are you prepared to put that on your soul to watch that happen just to believe, you know, or are you willing to entertain that historical behaviors on behalf of the Russian army were replayed in another war? You know, like that's the way that you should approach it, rather than just deciding, going into war mode, deciding, no, this person is giving that a pass and they are my enemy. No, they're probably not your enemy, and they're probably not whitewashing these things. They just don't know.
And I think
And
you got to ask the question, how people get down that rabbit hole. The answer, I think, is, you know, there's things they're trying to understand, things they're trying to piece together, things missing, things that don't make sense. And so, you know, they'll read one story, and then one story leads to another, another, and another, and another. So, of course, if you start to unpick just one of those stories, it's part of a tapestry. You know, you're only going to pick away at one of those threads. So I think the interesting thing about sort of doing this channel is it's not as effective to go and just try to undermine someone's story, because they may want to maintain the integrity of the tapestry. So they may resist ardently, you know, that little thread being pulled away. The best way to tell another story is to create a more compelling story. And that's why I think it's so useful to be able to see, you know, the Russian propaganda materials in the original, because stories emerge from it, personalities, belief systems, which you can then say, okay, well, you think that's come out of your big geopolitical view of the world. But actually, what are individuals saying? What are they thinking? One of the ones that made the biggest impression on me was not even a Russian propagandist. He's a Russian TV personality, but a very famous one. And in 2022, you know, they have these big New Year extravaganzas, you know,
yeah,
in Russia. Very staged, very kind of cheesy. And this guy came with the most sort of smug Cheshire cat kind of grin on his face, and a nauseating character. And he nodded his head a little bit and he said straight to the camera, you know, special military operation. Well, he said, Russia is expanding. This is what I predict for next year. Russia is expanding, and you better get used to it.
yep.
And that is what it's all about. It's not about NATO expansion, not about EU expansion. It's about Russia wanting to expand its power, its territory, its influence, project its non-values. And it's not accidental. There are a lot of people who know exactly what's going on and are exceedingly smug about it, exceedingly excited about the prospect of becoming an empire again. Well, not that it ever ceased to be one, but you know what I mean.
Restoring what they think they lost, you know. And that's so it's more, this brings us more into like the practical tactics for our side for how we fight this. Evil tells you what it is, always, always, because evil is proud to be evil, and it's like, it's why I roll my eyes when I start hearing about a dog whistle this, a dog whistle that. No movement. Like, first of all, evil movements believe sincerely in the rightness of what they're doing. There were no convinced Nazi Party members that had a doubt in their mind about the justification of what they're doing. You don't come to that point by having, you know, sly little people, you know, hey, maybe how about this, you know, insinuations and stuff. No, you say loudly and proudly what you're doing because you believe in the truth of it. And this is so, when our enemies show their evil so openly, that's beautiful. Thank you. They've given us a weapon. And the you know, the other thing too, in terms of like practical tactics for us, how do you reach these people and how you start taking apart the tapestry that has been woven for them, the tapestry of lies? You must never, ever lie. That's that, you know, I can tell you how these tapestries get woven is because these people. So let's look back at like WMDs in Iraq, right? Oh, we're gonna have a little WMDs in Iraq, Al Qaeda in Iraq, Saddam somehow having something to do with 9/11, and 2003. We are. We invade Iraq. We destroy that country. We lead to massive destabilization in the Middle East, and it was all for bullshit. It was all based on a lie. Was Saddam a bad person? Absolutely. Was that the selling point for the invasion? Absolutely not. Layers and layers and layers of lies. And there's a lot of people that feel, rightly or wrongly, that they've been lied to on in successive very large historical events. You know, it's something that's I don't want to create any more contention than is necessary or I've done already. But you know, you look at the early days of COVID when people were lied to and told a mask will do nothing to help you. And as a matter of fact, worrying about this virus makes you a racist. Saying that there's a virus coming from China means that you are unnecessarily stigmatizing the China and the Chinese community in XYZ country. Like that whatever reason that lie was told, even if it wasn't intended to be a lie, but that's where this stuff starts. When you start lying for any reason whatsoever. One of the things, like when people started propagating this Ghost of Kiev thing, you know, I remember reading that early on, and I shook my head because I'm like, this is obvious bullshit. Anyone who understands how the military works and understand kind of like broadly, not 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 I'm not an Air Force expert, but I understand like the kind of the number of kills that a tank should get, or that a person should get, or that a plane should get. And you're like, yeah, this one pilot, he's killed like 60 Russian pilots. That is obvious bullshit. And our side just shot ourselves in the foot by propagating that when we should have held back and said, hey, does this sound realistic? Let's look into it a little bit more. You know, we must not do that, because that whenever we knowingly or otherwise, and then listen, if you're saying something, you should know if it's you should. I mean, when someone's saying something on a public platform, they should be certain of the truth of what they're saying. If they're not, they shouldn't say it. And if they know it's not true, oh boy, you're only hurting yourself, because that's where when you lie, or when you say something that later has is proven to be a lie, you are unfortunately reinforcing that person's tapestry. Maybe they have the wrong impression. There's these things where it's like, yes, this is not well. Like let's use one of the Bolsheviks' own concepts, political correctness. Yes, it is not factually true, but for the uses of our movement, it is true. It is politically correct, or not true, but correct. Man, we cannot do that. We cannot, because that tool set it's a tool set of evil. It's oh my goodness, it's the term you coined, or one of your guests coined, the oh my God, the tools of autocracy, or whatever. Like the that those tools will not serve freedom. They won't. And so only by being relentless and making sure that we always tell the truth, that's how we're going to start unraveling the tapestry of lies that our enemy have created. And you know, some of it's going to be rough for us. Um, like the so you know, one of the things that's really hit us, and thank God it's starting to unravel now, is like some of the unpleasant people that were involved in Azov when it was a much smaller movement. Do those people represent all of Azov? Even then, no. But they were held up to. Were those people ejected from Azov when it was absorbed into the National Guard of Ukraine? Yes, they were. Are those people relevant to Azov today? Absolutely, 100% not. But if we just say no, there were never any unpleasant people in Azov ever, that's going to expose us to being painted with that liar paintbrush. Rather, it's like, hey, look, Azov was something that was required in a desperate moment, and Azov accepted a lot of people that they would not today in completely different circumstances. I knew guys. I knew a guy in Donbass Battalion, which was another of the nationalist battalions that was smeared in the same way that Azov was. And this guy, when he started fighting in 2014, he had a old sawed-off shotgun that was given to him, probably taken from some criminal gang. And it was like, congratulations, thank you for coming. Here's your weapon, sawn-off shotgun. And it was only when Petro Poroshenko put his own money down and bought black market weapons from the Russians, which is hilarious, from Russian criminals. That's Petro Poroshenko paid to have a Russian PKM delivered to Donbass Battalion in this case, and that became the guy's weapon that I knew. So he didn't have that piece of shit shotgun anymore. But yes, so rather than just deny and say no, there's no unpleasant people ever, there are no bad people on our side ever, you say, hey, here were the circumstances. So just like when the guy that I knew started fighting, he had nothing but a sawn-off shotgun to use. When the war began, units had to take whoever showed up. And if that person was some insane white supremacist from the West, but they were able to fight, Ukraine was not in a position to say no to that person.
There's an
Now,
interesting, it's an interesting parallel with Belarus, where mass protests, which really broadly cut across society, but when the regime resorted to extreme violence, there was no Azov to place themselves in that front line and meet violence with violence. Now, I'm not advocating for violence as an agent of change, but we saw in Belarus that those nascent protests was essentially snuffed out because the regime was prepared to go to a certain level, and it didn't meet the equivalent force for the
I
side of good.
that's that. So I will, as a I won't say lifelong soldier because it didn't start until I was 18, but as a soldier of many since I became an adult, I will advocate for violence because like people, we have a naive belief because we lived in an era, the most peaceful era that humanity's ever known, and prosperous era, the post World War II one, and especially the post Cold War era. For us in the West, that was the most peaceful and prosperous. It was not the same everywhere, but we came into this naive belief. It's the same as, like the end of history, that okay, we're now in an enlightened era where we no longer have those traits that led us to behave how we have throughout all of human history, and we can do away with these unpleasant things like violence. No, no. Unfortunately, violence is going to be with us for a very good long time yet until we. I think it's always going to be there. And when you need to resort to violence, you have to be willing to go to the limit. Now, does that mean, like, that doesn't sanction committing war crimes? Like, you're not going to go and murder the family of a policeman or a National Guardsman for the Belarusian government. That's not justified. But you do need to be willing to shoot them in a firefight, the guards, the National Guards or the police of that government. That's what it took here. That was the truth was the Ukrainian people were willing to stand up these volunteer formations and meet deadly violence with their own deadly violence. And it's the same. It's the same in war. If you say, hey, I will, yeah, I'm fine with using infantry, but tanks are far too violent. We're not going to use tanks. You do more than tie an arm behind your hand. You make it impossible for yourself to fight. And now there are certain things that you can say no to. For example, like recruiting foreign lunatics. You can say no to that when you have the luxury. But in 2014, Ukraine didn't have that luxury. And but that's so again, this is how we fight the narrative, is by not lying and saying, yes, there were things that under better circumstances would not have been done, like recruiting people that were quite extreme from foreign countries. But we didn't have the option, and here's why. And you know, if you that's the beauty of, like, our enemy uses plausible but untrue narratives to fight us. We can use plausible and true narratives to fight against them, but we have to be willing to, you know, you do have to risk a little bit, because you are going to lose a certain number of people by saying that that there are unpleasant people on our side, but you will have more to gain, because you won't be lying, and you won't be extending a falsehood, because down the line it's like you know, there was massive, to come back to the example I used earlier, in 2003 there was massive public support for invading Iraq, because consent had been manufactured. Now there's a huge backlash, in that the credibility of government, for me, I think it's good that government credibility has been hit this hard, because I think people are too used to good governance, where they think now that all governance is good, and that's not the case. But it's still, the price is always going to be paid. The butcher always comes to take his bill, because you just can't lie to people for forever. And that's why our side, if we're going to, you know, if we're talking about, like, and I think we should talk about it, participation of pro-Ukrainians in the Western culture war, we have to fight better, and part of that means never, 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 never lying. And it's tough. It's tough because, like, there are things that you don't want to say, that there's unpleasant people on our side, but there really are. I've met, you know, I've met some people, usually foreigners, that have come out here to fight, and absolutely, I respect that they're here to help us, but they as people are not anyone that I ever want to associate with, and frankly, I want them out of Ukraine as soon as possible. Because me, myself, one of our instructors and one of our interpreters were physically attacked by a group of foreigners. Um, they actually did fight. I'm not taking that from them, but they did a lot of other unpleasant things in addition to that, and to say nothing of attacking us. I can send you a photo later, actually, if I'll go dig them up. My face was pretty bruised up. Um, and it's just like, hey, you know, if I pretend that those guys don't exist, that doesn't take them out of the running. And so we don't lie about it. We say, yeah, hey, warts and all, here's the situation. Because the truth is, morally, the situation is just it's not even unbalanced in our favor. Morally, we have total high ground, absolute high ground. It doesn't mean we can go and say, oh, hey, yeah, let's mass execute Russian prisoners. No, that's not what is permitted for us. What is permitted for us is to be truthful about everything, and say, here's the situation. And that is how, like, that's how we can start to undermine support, like culture war based support for our enemies in the West. We don't need to engage with the grifters. We just need to find the engagements we can with, find the people, like you said, who, hey, I heard this. And then we can say, yeah, so here's how this started. Here's how this particular rumor started. And by presenting the truth, we can start to take apart that tapestry. But it doesn't happen fast, and you can't. I think a lot of people want to. It's what I said before. They see the urgency of the war out here, and they know the stakes, and so they want to take a shortcut to, like, force the other person to see things from their perspective. It's never going to work. You won't browbeat anyone into that. You won't scream at them into that. You can't call them names and tell them you're a monster for not supporting Ukraine. You're just going to turn them off. You have to be disciplined. It's just in that way. I would say that the people who are supporting us in the West, they are in a kind of war, and they do need to be soldiers. They need to be disciplined, and they need to know the best way. You know, when we train our guys, we always hit on discipline, coordination, control, because you don't just go, oh, there's the enemy over there, let's run at them and run at them shooting. That you're going to get wiped out. You attack them methodically. You attack them using the right weapons for the right situations, and don't you don't make it obvious. You wait until the last moment to reveal your presence, and you even if it wasn't meant to be an ambush, you try and make it as close to an ambush when you attack the enemy as possible. And so, in the sort of our soldiers in the culture war need to be disciplined as well, and they need to think, what is the best tactic here? And the best tactic is very rarely browbeating or yelling at somebody or calling them names. No, try
It's
to persuade.
refining your arguments up, testing and constantly improving, changing, shifting. And I've started doing a few debates with people who are absolutely not in the bubble, and some will have consumed a lot of points of view which are not really, supported by the evidence. Some will have thought quite a lot about that, and it's an interesting challenge to undermine that. Another area of truth telling, and this is going to be the last sort of question of this session, and we're going to have future discussions on these topics because it's almost like an endless supply of themes here to refine up. One problem as well is this idea of speaking truth and not telling the wrong thing, because that undermines your credibility. That's true. But also hiding difficult truths or not addressing difficult truths can be damaging as well. And one of those is to play down what it will take for Ukraine to be victorious, or to avoid the, yes, I'm pro-Ukraine, but I'm avoiding the conversation about how victory is achieved, what it looks like, the problems that might bring. Skirt over that, ignore it. These hard truths, I think, are an essential part of it. There's an extraordinary, Ukrainian activist called Mriya Report, and she very forcefully says, and she'll often say the hard bits that even some Ukrainians are really don't want to dig into. One of her points of view is, this idea of victory needs to speed up, because there aren't infinite numbers of Ukrainians, and there aren't infinite resources, and there isn't infinite patience. And actually, military technology and tactics are evolving incredibly fast. You cannot predict where they'll be in a year's time. They may be in your favor, they may not. So there's some extraordinary, powerful ideas that she expresses. So the last point here is, not telling falsehoods to get your point of view across. The second one is not going sort of full rage against your competitors, but try to pick your battles and influence people positively with evidence, but not everybody, because you're not going to win every battle. The third point, and final one I'd like to address there, is how do you tell the really tough truths? Because you need to do that, don't you, in order to persuade people of the very difficult decisions that are required to overcome those.
It's it's not easy, but it's like, I think everyone in their life has had these hard conversations. You think about, like, especially I think in relationships, in marital relationships, relationships with parents or kids, there are times when there is nothing to do but grit and just say it, and like one of the ones for me, which became very relevant sort of after the first year, and as we were approaching the kind of 2 year mark, and then we crossed the 2 year mark, is I just had to kind of admit to myself that this is going to be probably a 4 to 6 year war. We're lucky because if it's only that, because seems to be the historical trend with wars of this size, and we got to settle in. Like, it's going to mean major changes, and that's going to mean, like, if I want to, for example, if I want to maintain a semblance of normalcy in my life, I've got to make some adjustments, and fast. And you just got to be honest about it. You just have to. It's I mean, Stoic philosophy is really phenomenal for this, because it basically says, hey, look, you're out here on the ocean. You could scream all you want about how it's unfair that you can't control the waves, or you can learn to ride them. And that's what we need to do, as sort of to continue the thought line there of soldiers in a war is we've got to be stoic. We have to surf those waves because we're never going to control the ocean. And that part of that is just saying, like, you call a spade, and you say, yeah, look, this is a rough situation. We do, like, one of the things that is, it's not great to think about, but we are a much smaller nation against a brutal empire. We have fewer resources of our own. We do need assistance from the West. There's no question of that. Um, and like that means some things. That means that we can't get snippy with a politician who reasonably asks, what is the ability of our population in XYZ supporting country? What is our ability to actually support? Now, the thing with governments is they're super inefficient, and if they find efficient ways to do things, then they can support quite a lot. But I mean, good luck. Government inefficiency is the heart of so many domestic issues in every country. But just, be honest about it and say, and look and say, like, yeah, some people are going to be able to support more, some less. And there are countries, we talk about proportion of their GDP and stuff. We look at, like, the Baltic countries and how they are really knocking it out of the park in terms of support for Ukraine. Britain as well, because militarily Britain doesn't have, it's not on the same level as, like, the United States. Well, no one's on the same level as the United States, but still the British military has been shrinking and having resources drawn from it, and then now has to find resources to send here, and you guys have been. It's been amazing, but it's just, to be very concise. I have a issue with that, but to be, I mean, I'm not good at being concise always, but to be very concise is that you got to be stoic. Look at what the reality is and don't shy away from it. And sometimes the reality is tough. We've got a long, hard way out of this war, but victory, complete Ukrainian victory, restoration of Ukrainian territory to the recognized borders, the real borders, that is by far more preferable than the alternative, because we know any territorial concession, okay, we can sit there and look at what happened when the Sudetenland was conceded to the Germans. We know what the authoritarian mind, how the authoritarian mind interprets that. They go, excellent, another step on the path, another step on the path. And we know they'll come for more, because these rapacious, acquisitive authoritarians, they don't want a peace. They want it all, and they will come for more. And if we don't stand up and strongly repulse them, and so again, it's like being honest. It's saying, look, I'm not saying this is easy. I'm not saying it's going to be like, I'm not saying it's not going to take a huge toll. It already has. So what the saying is it's a cheapskate pays twice. And it really is the case, is if we don't do full press now and do everything we need to ensure Ukrainian victory, we're just going to have another likely larger war in a few years. Because we talk about it a lot on our side, and it's true. China is watching. Iran is watching, and North Korea, I don't think is the same threat as those two, but still, all the authoritarians are watching, and they're seeing, do the free people have the resolve necessary to resist us? And based on the answer that comes to them, they're going to make their next actions, because we are fools if we think that our enemies are not pragmatic. And so we have to show them the strength of free people. It's I mean, a lot of this stuff, we come back to the Tolkien references, but just only because it's so apt. And when the free peoples of Middle Earth were disunited, it gave room for Sauron to come back. And we mustn't make that mistake. We have to make it like in the time of the fellowship. I don't want to, anyway, I'll
And
get too nerdy.
that's the biggest argument against, it was NATO expansion. It was
Yeah.
NATO weakness that allowed this to happen, not strength or the threat of strength. But there are so many themes here that we'll pick up in our next conversation. But I think we've really got to grips with, I think, three of the core things about sort of lying, tackling lying, and being true to ourselves, which I think is incredibly important in this sort of deficit of trust that we have in many democratic systems in the West. But Kevin, we're going to pick this up in our next conversation. These are going to become monthly as we announce to the channel, and we're going to pick over a whole range of issues, as well as, of course, what is happening on the ground in Ukraine and with training of military. But for this episode, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan.